ancient Greek, particularly the classical Greek period. We're going to take the Greek period and actually kind of break it up into two pieces. This is the classical period, and then we're going to go on into kind of the Hellenistic period, these post-Alexander the Great. But we're going to be dealing with Greece and its history. It's really a long history. We've kind of moved out of the southern Mediterranean and the northern Mediterranean. And so some big, big changes in terms of society and government, economics, military history, the battles between what is sort of an Eastern top-down kind of organizational idea, a Western versus bottom-up kind of organizational idea, how those ideas play off each other, and one of these ideas is going to wind up surviving and the other one's not. So I think to get started, we need to go all the way back. When we look at this map of the northeastern Mediterranean basin, what you'll notice is lots and lots of water. The Aegean Sea, and then as it joins into the rest of the Mediterranean, we'll notice the presence of very long, rocky coastlines and also a lot of islands sort of dotting their way across the Aegean. And so this is going to be a major factor in why the experience with the Greeks that then gets transmitted to the rest of world civilization kind of happens the way that it does. To get started with the first major European, or the first major of the Greek civilization is actually the Minoan civilization, and this is something that actually we have named it. The period here is going to begin somewhere around about 2,800 years ago, and this civilization is going to flourish till about 1450 BC or so. Right? So these are approximate dates based on largely kind of archaeological evidence. And it's going to be on what is now known as the island of Crete with its capital of Knossos. And so this is where these guys are going to be operating out of. So it's actually now off this kind of the southeastern coast. This civilization was very much a trade magnate. It controlled the trade in the northeastern Mediterranean, with the lines crossing out of the Black Sea, in and out of there, and then going east and west across the northern part of the Mediterranean, and then the lines going north and south along the eastern shore of the Mediterranean. So it's an extremely important crossing point. And you have extremely wealthy cities. Its architecture was noted for its complexity. A lot of the mythology that people think of the labyrinth is going to center around the fact that these multi-story, multi-room palaces were large enough to get lost in, and were like mazes. The houses themselves and the cities themselves were also laid out on a grid. They were extremely well-planned, well-organized, and even had functioning sewer systems. Now, these guys' demise is caused by both natural causes, a volcanic explosion in this area. We think that that's going to be what's going to bring these guys down. And then also man-made invasion reasons. One of the most likely scenarios, although we're not 100% sure on this, is going to be that there's this sort of volcanic event that weakens these guys, and then external invasion is going to finish these guys off. But that is the course of events. And so here you can see one of the sites of these volcanic explosions, and then one of the pots here, where there's a little bit of stonework from the Crete civilization, right? What's going to replace these guys as the dominant cultural center is going to move from the islands off the coast onto the mainland, and it's this Mycenaean culture. The Mycenaean, again, this is a name that we have applied to it in part based on Greek mythology. But who were the Mycenaeans, or at least the ones that we call Mycenaeans? They're an Indo-European people. They were from kind of mid-Asia, and they're going to invade the Greek mainland from the northeast, and they're going to conquer / displace the people that are there. And that's going to take place roughly around 1600 BC. A lot of these guys, at that point, it's a pre-literate society, so they don't have a lot of quote-unquote history on this, but that's the archaeological data that we have. Now, these guys are very much a warrior culture. They're the ones that are going to come in, not unlike we see with the Aryans that move into the Indus River Valley in what is now northwestern India and take over. These guys are warrior people. They come up and they establish a powerful city-state kind of style of government. And this is due to the somewhat unique geography here of the Mediterranean basin, especially in Greece, where you have these kind of pockets of arable land and then mountains and ridges that separate them from each other. And in many cases, it's much easier to get at one another militarily by sea rather than on land. And so these city-states are going to spring up, and they are going to have sort of local power and local control from the top down. These guys, as a larger world unit, are going to maintain and extend the trade and economic control throughout this region thanks to their large and powerful military, which will eventually take to the water. if you want to sort of verge into the mythological, possibly, these are the ones that, if you want to attribute anybody to the Trojan War on the Greek side, these are the guys that would have done it. And there's some indication that somebody probably would have come in and attacked one of the cities that you and I would know as Troy. This would have taken place somewhere in the neighborhood of 1250. I have probably in parentheses because there's obviously a lot of mythologization of the Trojan War. But we do know that this Mycenaean culture, despite the fact that it's a large, powerful sets these city-states up, they get conquered by someone and fell by about 1100 BC or so. A couple of scenes here of Mycenaean culture. You can see the bustling ports and facilities as they're engaging in trade and or warfare with other people, some of their pottery, and then this gives you an idea of how you've got the arable land surrounding some of these city-states, and then they go up into kind of the more arid pasture lands until eventually you get into the really rough country that demarcates a lot of the area of these city-states because of the geography. So a few scenes here of what potentially the Trojan War, if it's a historical fact, may have looked like, to give you an idea of some of the fighting that takes place there. Well, when the Mycenaean culture floundered, what's going to happen here is Greece is going to enter into very much what we call a dark age. Now, it doesn't actually mean physical darkness. The sun doesn't, lose any of its potency or anything like that. But we are going to see a rapid decrease in intellectual activity. Basically, we attribute this to a lot of the learned and educated people either being sold off into slavery, killed, run off, something like that. And every single intellectual product, architecture, art, literature, and even some of your basic farming and architectural techniques really are all going to suffer. Trade nearly comes to a halt. And when trade equals wealth, basically wealth is going to come to a halt as well. Now, we know that there is invasion, but if you want to point the finger at who exactly is to blame for this invasion, it gets a little fudgier in that regard. Some people have blamed these sea peoples that sort of show up throughout various points of history to show up and attack. Or it may have been these Doric sons of Heracles, the sons of Hercules. They may be the ones that attack. We're not exactly sure. We do know that the Dorians are the ones that wind up in charge of most of Greece, except for the Athens area, where we think that basically a lot of the original culture of the Mycenaeans, they get defeated, they get pushed backwards, and they kind of funnel through the area of Athens, which does remain pretty well defended. Athens gets pretty full, the Athens area gets really kind of overcrowded, and so a lot of the old Mycenaean culture are going to wind up adopting the name the Ionian Greeks, and are going to move out here throughout the Aegean, and are going to colonize a lot of the islands, all the way off to the western part of what is now the modern state of Turkey, where they're on kind of the western shores and the islands off of the west coast of the Anatolian Peninsula. We're also going to see that it's during this period that the use of iron weapons, iron tools, things like that, are going to come into use towards the end of the Greek Dark Age. And when you look at a couple of the pieces of pottery, normally in our society we consider that technology constantly goes forward, that over the course of time it gets better and better and better. And so you would expect when looking at these two pots created by Greek culture that the one that's really ornate and artistic and in different colors and requires different kind of pigments, you say, well, that's the later one, because this one's just, it's got lines and it's flat and it's kind of dull. Obviously, people further back in history, slower, dumber people made that. In fact, it's the reverse. This is a period from, this is a pot from the Mycenaean period, and this is one from the Greek Dark Age period, and it shows how much technology had regressed just in this one field. Well, one of our other major figures that we have to talk about is Homer. He is credited with writing both the Iliad and the Odyssey, right? The Iliad is this great sort of epic poem about the Trojan War. The Odyssey is sometimes referred to as the first kind of novel written in human history about the aftermath of this guy who's trying to get home from the Trojan War. But of course, we're not exactly sure if Homer even really deserves credit for this. Was Homer a real guy? There's a lot of debate within history. For us in our story, it actually isn't all that important if we want to credit a guy, Homer, with writing this or not, because it's the written work itself that actually makes a bigger historical impact. Because as it's published and as it's sent around, it brings a great deal of comfort to Dark Age Greece, because this is a multi-hundred-year period of time, and is really going to be the way that voice is given to Greek virtues by whomever it is that had done this, and is going to help pump up what they consider to be their sense of right and wrong, valuable character traits, etc. Because this is going to get injected through much of Greek culture due to its use as a textbook. How do you teach kids to read and write? You have them copy stuff down and write it for themselves, have them read it out loud. And so one of the major textbooks is going to be the Iliad, and it's going to be the Odyssey, right? So what are these values that these educating minds are going to be inculcated with? And that is going to be the idea of courage, both physical courage and moral courage, but also moderation. The idea that the Greeks, they didn't like people who overdid something. They were either too happy or too sad, too courageous, too prideful, too humble. It didn't really matter what it was. They kind of liked the idea of moderation. They liked the idea of loyalty. When you make a promise, you keep it, even if it means you got to go and die, right? But above all, they were very fatalistic people, and the idea that you have to submit yourself to whatever your fate was. If your fate was you get killed horribly, then they really, really liked the guys who go out and say, all right, that's my destiny, I'm going to embrace it, even if it means being ripped to pieces by some ugly monster, right? Whatever it is, they like this idea that you're going to submit yourself to fate. Well, this spoke of this Mycenaean age at a point when it was already hundreds of years in the past. And this brought back a great sense of nostalgia, although I would really caution you to not read Homer for plumbing it for a great deal of fact. But from this, we get the great examples, like you'll see, of the Trojan horse, which illustrates one of these great Greek virtues. Obviously, the Greeks had figured out how to trick the Trojans, but for the Trojans, it was the fate to be destroyed because of their terrible pride, right? That the Greeks had left this giant horse, that they were going to bring it within the walls of the city to show how awesome they were, and of course, that is going to be their downfall. Whether or not that actually happened in history doesn't really matter, but it does give us a nice little cultural window into what these ancient Greeks, during the classical period, they're going to be looking back to and saying, hey, these are the virtues that we like, all right? We're also going to see the evolution of the political system here, and this is sometimes referred to as the polis system, right? Polis is the Greek word for city. And over the course of time, these local tribes are going to consolidate themselves into these city-states. And you guys are hopefully now fairly comfortable with that idea of a city-state, where you've got this urban organization that then kind of also is directly connected to its immediately outlying rural area. And that's what's taking place here after the Dark Age ends. There's a lot of social tumult that takes place during the Dark Ages, and then once that begins to settle down and society gets itself back organized, is the city-state system is going to reemerge in a really, really strong way. Like I said, it's going to emulate the typical city-state system that we talked about for places like Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro and Sumer and the Nile cultures and blah, blah, blah. So that's not terribly different. But what you're going to see here is some really well-defined borders due to the broken geography. When you look on the picture here of Greece and then its port city, of Athens, all of this is considered Athens. Even all the way back into the farmland, while you may live in a village, you are considered part of Athens because of the city-state system. So there's really, really strong ties economically, socially, and politically between all these people here, whether you're in the rural area or the urban area, with the city. You're considered all a part of this as well. One of the other major social changes is going to take place during this period through military changes. Whenever we talk about social changes that take place, there is going to be a concomitant military and political change. Conversely, if you have a military and political change that takes place, there are also going to be a social change that takes place with this. In this case, economic advance is going to lead to the creation of a kind of trading middle class. That's going to cause some changes in terms of the military. Now, for a long time, like a lot of cultures, the Greeks had relied on the wealthy to provide kind of the backbone of their military, because the cavalry, these guys on horseback that are fighting, they were kind of the dominant force on the battlefield. But having a horse and having all the equipment, that wasn't expensive then, or that wasn't cheap then, it was pretty expensive. And it's not cheap now. It's a pretty expensive proposition to outfit yourself for war on a horse. You also had foot soldiers, but they were generally pretty poorly armed. They were poor. They got what they kind of could, or they got what they were issued by their government, depending on the situation. And so that was the way that it was. The wealthy could claim a legitimate amount of power in society. How come you rich guys are in charge? Well, if it wasn't for us, you'd all be enslaved by another culture. Oh, right? And as long as that's true on the battlefield, then it plays out in society about like you think it ought to, right? Which is, you guys are in charge, you're wealthy, you're powerful, how come we have to listen to you? Because we defend you. Our wealth is used to defend you through the military. Okay. What if that changes? What if that changes, right? And in fact, as you're seeing here, as Middle people began to have access to more and more of their own resources, they began to be able to afford their own armor and weapons that could make them just as formidable against other infantry and also other cavalry. And they would form these phalanxes, these block formations of soldiers with these very long spears, and they would keep together in these tight units. And not only could they kind of drive enemy infantry off the field through just sort of force of numbers, but because of the long spears, they could even drive sort of cavalry forces away. So what you're seeing here is, as long as these guys were willing to work together as a team and not get broken up into single kind of units, they could dominate a battlefield. And ever increasingly, what you're going to see is a lot of these battles on land would be dominated by which group of hoplites, in fact, was the best, rather than which group of cavalry was the best, right? When that situation on the battlefield changes, they're going to ask these wealthy, powerful members of the, for example, the military nobility, how come you guys are in charge again? We're the ones that are actually deciding battles on the battlefield. That then is going to lead to some political evolution as well. We're going to see that throughout this period too, not only is there a great deal of activity socially and politically, but also in terms of geography. This is also a period where the Greeks are sending out colonies out to the Black Sea, out to North Africa, out to eventually Central and Western Europe, as they colonize outward for trade purposes and to take advantage of local sort of economic situations. And so you're going to find this culture is going to go with them. It's going to go with them all the way out to places like southern France and places in what is now Italy, North Africa. And so this is going to become ever increasingly, at least partially Hellenized as a result of that. We can look at a couple of examples of Greek city-states to give you an idea of how different some of them were. We don't really have time to do all of them, but one that's pretty famous, right, is Sparta. Most of you are familiar with Sparta. Maybe one of your favorite college teams is the Spartans, or maybe one of your high school teams is named the Spartans, right? These guys were the descendants ethnically of those Doric invaders. And their view of society, because of the small size of Sparta, was that the rest of the world was out to get them. Right? The rest of the world is just waiting to crash down on their tiny little city-state, and they're surrounded by potential enemies. They're really, really looking at the other Greek city-states as these guys are going to invade us and take us over. So they developed very much a kind of military first. We are going to have a living wall of soldiers around us. And so to that end, culturally, they became very stoic, hardworking, and pretty austere kind of people. They strove to ferret out any kind of defects in babies. They wanted to see that a lot of male children were really highly educated in terms of physical and mental preparations for war. They stressed the idea that there should be obedience to the state. And so the military becomes the primary goal, essentially, of the society for quite a long time. And it shouldn't surprise us that they get really good at it, right? If an entire society decides, hey, we're all going to do this and we're going to work towards this goal, there's a pretty good chance that that's going to happen, right? For example, they encouraged athletics both in men and women. This wasn't always the case. Women were oftentimes regarded as kind of second-class citizens in Greek society, at least on a good day in some regards. But the reason for this was, for men, well, you want to be able to run and jump and hurl heavy things. Well, that's a preparation for war. Makes a lot of sense. But what about women? The idea at the time was a big, healthy, strong woman, one that can do athletic things. She was ready for motherhood. She could crank out a lot of warrior babies. So here's Leonidas, right, one of the great Spartan figures of this period. Almost on the other side here, definitely ethnically different, is the Athenians, right, Athens. In a lot of ways, Athens is kind of the cradle of the European classics for art, literature, theater, music, government, a lot of ideological flowering that we still are affected by today is going to come from Athens during this classical period. Now, it's been consolidated by these Ionian Greeks, not Doric Greeks, after the Dark Ages. But Athens is going to struggle with class conflict, like we were talking about before. How come the rich guys are in charge? How come the nobility that are born into power are in charge? So this is going to be a big problem for these guys to try to come to grips with, and you're going to see that in terms of the governmental front. Guys like Solon are going to start kicking the can down the road for moving things towards democracy, but not quite democracy yet. Solon's going to introduce some reforms to try to get more people involved in state affairs, but we aren't quite to the point, we'll see a little bit later, where everybody's going to have a say. At least all the males are going to have a say in the government. Now, part of this political evolution is going to be tyranny. when we start throwing around the word tyrant today, we normally think of a kind of evil dictator, a Hitler, a Stalin, some sort of movie supervillain or something like that, and they want to seize power and kind of be a jerk with it. But a tyrant, at this point, anybody who seized power illegally was a tyrant. You could be a pretty popular tyrant. In fact, what we'll see here is some of these guys were actually almost beloved tyrants, at least by some people, right? But this was actually a pretty endemic problem through Greece in the 7th and the 6th century BC, because ever increasingly a lot of the Greek city-states, not only Athens, are going to have problems with class conflict, who's in charge and why, and we're going to see that tyrannies are going to get set up in a lot of different places. Now, not to overgeneralize, but generally speaking, these guys are going to lead some kind of insurrection, some kind of revolution, a coup against the state or something like that. They're going to seize power by force, but in a lot of cases, they're generally pretty popular because they advocated for large masses of what had been the middle and lower classes. In fact, a lot of these guys are pretty famous for building projects like wells and markets, walls, aqueducts. They were patrons of sort of public displays of art, etc. And so instead of kind of taking the resources of the state and using them for themselves, at least that's what people thought that the nobility and or monarchies, depending on the city-state, these guys were kind of pumping stuff back into the state. Now, the most famous of all these was a guy named Cypselus of Corinth, the Corinthian city-state. He ruled well. He had kind of led this popular surge against the powers that existed before he got into office. But one of the problems that every government has to face is, okay, how do we maintain consistency? How do we ensure that this government transitions from kind of one generation to the next? So that way there's not disorder. We want to make sure that things are pretty orderly, right? For example, in a democratic republic like the United States, you have elections every few years, and then you mix the old people out, you mix the new people in, and that's how you do it. Well, how do you do this with a tyranny? This guy seized power. Eventually, at some point, though, his number's going to be up, and he's going to die. Well, if Cypselus was a good guy, maybe his son will be a pretty good guy as well, or his grandson, or somebody in his family. But what's going to happen is these guys are going to turn into the same kind of dictators that the previous kings and or sort of ruling oligarchies had been before. Because the assumption is, well, we were born into power, and so that's why we have it. This is then going to cause a revolt. So this calls into question one of the basic ideas of government, which is, okay, this isn't stability. We need to not have a revolution every 20 to 30 years. So that's not good. We don't want to have a civil war every generation or so to determine who's going to be in charge. So the Greeks are going to seek more stability in government. We're going to see that Athens is going to provide at least one of the main leading lights in this. Athens goes through a period of tyranny like a lot of the Greek city-states do. And you'll see that Cleisthenes is the one who really comes in at the end of this process to institute a lot of these democratic reforms. Now, there'll be people that will go on later to try to add some more democratic reforms to this. But the idea behind this is all groups of citizens could choose members for this ruling council, but in many cases this was at random. All those decisions of those councils had to be ratified by democratic vote. You could have open debate on any issue, and then generally speaking you had to have a quorum of people in the city go and cast a vote, but then you just have a majority rule. What should we do for this? We should do this. Should we tax that? Yeah, we should tax that. Right? Whatever, it was majority rule. And that was how they did this. Should we hire so-and-so? Should we have this guy be our admiral of our fleet, general of our army, things like that. And so that's generally speaking how it worked. This system is going to stand very much in stark contrast to one of its main neighbors, and that is one of the great empires of world history, and that's the Persian Empire. And in a lot of ways, this is kind of an East versus West struggle. The Greeks very much represented individualism, where people could vote, they were held to be equal, at least in Athens at this point, right? The Persians had very much the idea of a top-down imperial control. We had levies for troops. You guys do what you've got to do. We have the satrapies. The governors do what the emperor says to do. If you defy us, we come and we kill you. That kind of thing, right? Actually, this is, if you want to cast the blame at who threw the first punch, in a lot of ways the Greeks really were the ones to get the ball rolling, because the Persians had conquered much of what had been the Ionian territory in what is now the western parts of Turkey and the Anatolian Peninsula. These guys had a revolt. These were Greek people that were revolting against the Persians, and they didn't like that. Well, Athens had sent over a fleet of ships and said, hey, we'll help these guys revolt against the Persians. Well, the Persians come in and they drop the hammer on the Ionians, but they notice that, hey, the Athenians are getting involved, and they kind of file that away. we need to maybe deal with these guys. They're Greeks, these guys are Greeks, maybe it's not such a good idea, maybe we need to eventually expand into Greece. And that's what's going to happen is a few years later is the emperor at this point, Darius, is going to send a ridiculously huge army to attack Greece at Athens. Partly in revenge for interfering in the Ionian revolt, and partly just simple imperial expansion. They want to deal with a potential threat. Also, this is going to allow them to expand. They're going to come across the water and do more or less a direct assault against Athens. Now, the Athenians, they get wind of this. I mean, people see the Persian ships being loaded down with soldiers, and they go and they tell the Athenians. The Athenians knew that this was going to happen. And they call on the other Greek city-states for aid. They're saying, hey, look, they're not going to stop with us. They're going to come, they're going to conquer us, and they're going to get a foothold here on the mainland, and they're going to come for you guys next. So this is going to be sort of battlefield Aegean, is what's going to take place here throughout the Persian Wars. And initially, the first one is going to be more or less a straight shot here for the first major engagement, which is going to lead us to the Battle of Marathon. Now, the Persians are going to land on the east coast of the Attica Peninsula, and they're going to wind up being about 26 miles from Athens when they come ashore, right? The problem that the Persians have is their army is actually too big to kind of all get off the ships all at the same time on the beach. But it doesn't really matter because you have only a few Athenian, you only have a few thousand Athenian and Plataean hoplites under this general named Miltiades to oppose them. And so you're not going to need the whole army anyway. The half the force is going to outnumber these Greeks like 5 or 6 to 1 anyway. And so we're going to get these guys off. We'll shoo the Athenians off the beach. We'll create enough of a landing area, right? And then we'll get everybody off and we'll march to Athens and we'll wipe them out. That's the plan, right? So what they do is they actually pull up pretty close here. The Persians are getting ready to have the second wave come off, and so they're waiting on the deck and they're going to watch the battle, right? Well, Miltiades, though, has a plan, right? He understands that while the Persian army outnumbers him, he's got him kind of in a little bit of a choke point with a shallow little draw that comes down to the coast. And what he does is he posts the Plataeans in the center, and he also understands that person for person, his Greeks are much more heavily armored. These Greek hoplites are going to be much better at sort of keeping with each other and fighting as a unit and in a one-on-one engagement with these Persians. And so what he does, he engages these guys, and the Persians attack them, and they're fighting these guys off, and then he has the Plataeans withdraw. And this leaves a giant hole kind of in the center of the Greek line, and of course the Persians are like, aha, we've broken through the center, and they all start funneling in, but it turns out to be a trap, right? The Plataeans turn around at bay, and they're holding these guys back, and then the wings of the Athenians kind of turn in on them, and they start squashing these guys from three sides. All of a sudden, they're now pushing these guys back towards the beach, and they manage to get them all the way back in the water, and they're killing these guys all the way into the surf. And then, of course, they shouting at the Persians, the rest of the army who are up on the ships, hey, you guys come down, you know, we'll take care of you guys too. And, well, there's no place for us to get off. Well, the Athenians, we'll back up. Here, we'll give you plenty of room. Come on out. No thanks, right? That was enough, right? Enough was enough, right? Persia is going to retreat from Greece for 10 years. Actually, the Persians are going to get busy with some internal political stuff. But they haven't forgot about the Greeks or the drubbing that they give them at Marathon. In fact, we still at least partially celebrate this victory today when we run the Marathon, right? The messenger that goes back to Athens it's a 26.2, 0.4 something mile race where I don't know that he has to shout Nike at the end, but they have to run the distance, and that's the end of the Olympics every year, right? Well, Darius is going to die, right? He's going to die, and his son Xerxes is going to inherit the kingdom. He has a little bit of political tumult. He's got to put some stuff down, but he understands that expansion into Greece is going to knock out what is now a major political and military opponent. So the first invasion, or attempted invasion, takes place in 490 BC. So 10 years later in 480, he's going to launch another massive invasion of Greece with, at least according to some accounts, you got about 150,000 men on land, a ridiculously large army. It's hard to believe an army of that size given at that time, but this is what some of the sources say. The important thing is you do have an enormous army, right? And you also have, in case the one or the other is defeated, like you see at Marathon, instead of putting all your eggs in one basket, he has 1,000 ships at sea. So you've got an ocean force that's coming down out of the water, you've got a land force that's marching down over land. The idea here is to stop these guys before they can get to Athens at a very narrow gorge called Thermopylae. the hot gates, right? That is this narrow gorge where the road runs right next to the sea, and you get this huge ridge line, and so you're going to stopper these guys up. They know that the 9,000 Greeks that they have at their disposal isn't going to be enough to defeat 150,000 or however many the Persians have. You don't have to do that. You don't have to actually kill all of them. If you hold them up long enough in an era before refrigeration and before you could have freeze-dried army rations and things like that, armies, generally speaking, had to live off the land. And if you can keep an army that size in one spot for long enough, it'll start to starve to death. And it'll have to retreat or fall apart. And of course, this narrow opening meant it didn't matter how many guys the Persians had. They could only send a few of them at a time at you. One of the main leaders here of the Greeks is this Spartan king Leonidas. He was only allowed to bring 300 of his own men. Sparta was trying to avoid entanglements with the Persian Empire. But Leonidas really did see the threat of Persia to all of Greece. So naturally he picks 300 of his best men. And as this fighting starts here on the first day, right, they slaughter these guys. The Greeks just hold these guys back. In fact, the number of Persian corpses becomes serious battlefield obstacles for the Persians. They have to stop fighting and drag the dead out of the way because they're just holding them up at this little stopper point. Well, the next day dawns, and the Persians have kind of found some goat paths to get up and around the Greek army, and they're going to be able to attack them from all sides. Leonidas orders the rest of the Greek force away. He says, we'll hold these guys as long as we can with the 300 of us, and manages to hold them out for the rest of the day. But this means it's a complete breakdown of the entire defensive strategy. The defensive strategy was to hold these guys here, their army will get hungry, and then it'll go away, but instead it's broken through. So this is a pretty bad turn of events. The Athenians, upon finding out that the Persians have broken through and that their city is now threatened, come to a pretty momentous decision. They decide that Athens isn't the walls, Athens isn't the buildings, Athens isn't even the temple on top of the Acropolis. Athens is us. Athens is the people. And we're going to escape. We're going to abandon the physical city, and we're going to head westward before the Persians can arrive and either kill or capture us. Right? This is going to bring them pretty close to Salamis Bay, and they're not going to be able to get around it to the north. They've got the Persian army that figures out eventually that the Athenians have given them the slip, and they're going to start chasing them down. They're not going to be able to go around Salamis Bay. They need to get across it, but that means that they're going to need the Greek fleet to kind of carry these guys across Salamis Bay so they can get away. The problem with this is the Persian navy, which has now appeared off the mouth of the Straits of Salamis. And a lot of the other Greek navies that are part of the combined Greek fleet, they want to get out of there. Persians are going to trap us in here. They're going to kill all of us, right? You Athenians want to stay and ferry your own people, that's fine. We're leaving. We're not going to die here because of the fact that Persians, they outnumber us really, really badly, right? The Athenian admiral, what you and I would call an admiral, right, is a guy named Themistocles, and he gathers all the ship captains and he gathers all the admirals of the other fleets onto his ship, and basically he kind of insults them. He says, you guys are a bunch of women, if you run and hide, don't you want to stay? And of course, that kind of works, but also he makes a pretty strong argument that, listen, we know the way the wind moves here, we know the way the tides are, and we've got a narrow opening here through Salamis, into Salamis Bay, through the Straits, that they're not going to be able to get all of the ships in to attack. So we're only going to have to deal with part of the Persian navy at a time, and so we've got a lot of advantages. This proves to be a pretty convincing argument to the other Greek admirals, and so the Greeks decide to offer battle. Xerxes himself sets up a little pavilion on one of the islands in the Straits so he can watch this big naval battle. And he gets to watch his fleet get half crunched into oblivion, right? As the Greek ship maintain their order, right? And they come in and they crunch these guys, and they ram into them, and then they fight them, and then they pull back, and then they ram the next group and crunch them and fight them and drive them back. And eventually the Greeks start chasing away the Persian navy. The Persian navy is forced to give up and retire across the ocean, right? What's going to happen is, as the Persian navy the Persian army is continuing to work its way across the Greek peninsula, it is constantly getting weaker, and the Greeks are getting stronger as they're able to police up more and more soldiers that want to join the cause. Finally, at Plataea, the Greeks are going to unite on land, and they're going to turn the Persians back, and they're going to defeat their army. So here's a couple of scenes of this. This is the Battle of Salamis Strait. You can see the Greeks are kind of mushing up here against the Persian fleet. They don't have a lot of room to maneuver, so they can't use their numeric advantage against the Greeks. And then here's a couple of scenes of fighting here, of how close it is between the much more heavily armed Greeks here at Plataea and the more lighter mobile force of the Persians, but that mobility really isn't going to be able to be used in these close quarters kind of fighting, right? Well, the Persians had attacked the Greeks twice, and the Persian Empire is still out there. There's no reason to think that the Persians aren't going to just come back and try to finish the deal in round 3. So one of the questions that a lot of the Greeks had begun to kind of discuss with each other is, shouldn't we do something to try to work together so that way we can prevent the Persians from attacking us, rather than kind of the last 2 times, which was just, we sent out a note, hey, the Persians are attacking us, maybe you guys should show up. So a more permanent defensive league is what the Greeks decided they want to do. They realize they're going to have to put aside some of their mistrust and their differences about each other in order to form this. But they still don't really like and or trust each other a whole lot. So, for example, when they formed this, they call this the Delian League. They're putting ostensibly the capital and the treasury on the itty-bitty island of Delos, where almost nobody lives. It's small townsville in Greece. Because they didn't trust any of the big city-states. They're worried that if they put the capital and the treasury there, then they're going to take over. And it turns out that's exactly what happens. Over the course of the next several decades, Athens is going to ever increasingly take control of the league, in part through its economic control. Well, hey, since we're doing most of the trade and we're using mostly the Athenian money to do this, we should have the treasury here. The treasury here should use Athenian money. If it relates back to the military, then eventually we should have political control over your internal decisions, to the point that eventually it becomes an Athenian empire. Athens, over the march of time, becomes pretty much the power that's in charge of the other Greek city-states. And the city-state that really resents this the most and begins working against Athens is Sparta. Sparta is despising what it sees as Athenian political control and begins to conspire against them, right? And one of our main figures here in this Greek civil war that's fought in part on the Peloponnesian Peninsula, so that's why it's referred to as the Peloponnesian War, is a guy named Pericles. Pericles of Athens deserves a lot of credit for expanding its democracy in Athens, but also is inadvertently going to help engineer its downfall, right? The Athenians are going to go to war with Sparta over the fact that Sparta is trying to give a lot of pushback here on Athens' control over the defensive league, and pretty much what you would think would happen when somebody goes and sends an army out against Sparta is what happens, right? The Spartans kind of kick the crap out of them. So you're going to have one losing war with Sparta. Pericles, though, and whipping up popular support because it takes a democratic vote, he says, we need another war. Because now we're worried about Sparta's growing political power, that other city-states now are joining in with Sparta because they saw them beat us, right? Now, as long as Pericles is alive, actually, I mean, as dumb as it is to say, because we know that Athens is going to lose the war, actually, Athens' plan and what it was doing was actually pretty bright, and it was working, okay? Pericles came up with this idea, right? Generally speaking, Athens should try to fight most of its battles at sea. It should use its navy, because its navy was much more dominant than Sparta's navy, and it could land troops along the coast. It could threaten any of Sparta's allies or Sparta itself, and then once their army, their big powerful army, sort of came at them, then they could retreat back over the ships and they could go elsewhere. You can blockade the coastline. And on land, instead of going out to fight the Spartan army, they should remove themselves back behind the walls of Athens. Right? And then force the Spartans to fight kind of a long siege against them rather than an open field battle, which is almost a guaranteed Spartan victory. Now, as this was going on, it was working. It was working pretty well. Well, one of the problems of packing a lot of people into one of these cities here in the ancient world is disease. And you're going to see a big plague is going to hit Athens while all these people are in there, and a lot of the citizens are going to die, including Pericles himself. Right? And when that happens, the war and the kind of the war leadership really spirals out of control for the Athenians. The Athenians decide that one of the potential allies here for the Spartans is Sicily, and of course it would be a big pickup for them if they could attack Syracuse and Sicily, and so they're going to do that, and they're really kind of taking their eye off the ball with attacking somebody that's not named the Spartans. And also they're getting tired of the Spartans kind of making fun of the fact that they're too cowardly to come out and fight on land. So we're going to march our army out, we're going to be men, and we're going to fight the Spartans. Both of these policies are going to fail, right? This far-flung adventure here into Sicily is going to get bogged down eventually into local fighting and defeat for the Athenians, and then also pretty much what you would think when you go out and you fight against the Spartans is what usually happens is what happens to the Athenians. Athens' army is defeated, and in fact, Sparta is going to march into it in 404 BC. But what's going to happen is Sparta is really not in any kind of political situation, nor do they have the inclination to be the supreme city-state in Greece. It's too small, and they don't really want to do that. And we will see eventually somebody's going to come along. I think the Thebans will defeat the Spartans, and they get it for a while, and then I think Corinth gets it for a while. And so Greece sort of falls into this spiral of kind of unending war after war, with different city-states kind of trading the top spot for hegemony. So this is what you can see, orange on the map. This is the Athens and its allies. You'll notice that most of these are maritime kind of trading city-states, whereas the Peloponnesian Peninsula, right, the Sparta and its league are going to be here in purple. When we talk about the cultural contributions of the Greeks, there are several different kind of areas where the Greeks make the classical Greeks, especially the Athenians, make some huge leaps forward that are going to inform a lot of the intellectual route all the way down to today. One of these is going to take place in history itself. And the study of history prior to the ancient Greeks was in part, mysticism, mythology, gods and goddesses, giant monsters, weird kind of stuff. The supernatural was just, it flavored all in throughout it. A lot of political, biased political views made their way into, the founding fathers of cities and things like that. Herodotus is one of these guys who comes along, and then also later guys like Thucydides are going to look at, okay, let's start with some actual events. This is what happened. And one of their first projects that guys like this are going to work on is the history of the Persian Wars. They wanted those to be told. And they were serious about talking to people who were there, writing down a chronological series of events. And I know that these seem like really basic steps now, but at that point history was a story, it was a narrative. The Greeks began to focus more, okay, let's talk about facts and what actually happened, as opposed to maybe a moral message that went along with this. And so this is going to give us this much more rational, sober approach towards history rather than just mythologization, right? Another major area of contribution is going to come from theater. The Greeks essentially invent what we have now. A lot of cultures had it, right? But the modern version that most places are going to have heavily influenced by the Greeks. Now, all of it initially had its roots in religious activities, but they're going to incorporate these various parts of this: spectacle, costumes, things to look at, sets, song, messages, the moral, and of course, high dramatic moments. And eventually we'll also talk about comedy, right? Now, the first major theme that you would see, the first genre that really dominated a lot of these Greek plays was the tragedy, right? It emphasized the idea that you should just, devote yourself to whatever your fate was, even if your fate was terrible. And it was the people that had so much pride that they wanted to try to avoid that fate that really, really bad things happened to. The best example of this, of course, is Oedipus the king, right? He prophesied to have something really horrible happen to him, and when he tried to avoid it, something horrible happened to him. So, and we generally don't like tragedies now. There aren't a lot of tragedy movies and plays made because we don't like to go through a movie and feel terrible about what's going on. But the Greeks liked this because they had what they call a catharsis, where bad things would happen to guys like Oedipus, and you go, well, at least it wasn't me, right? So they liked that. Some leading figures of these playwrights were engaged in this was Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides. These are some good examples. You can still download and look at some of these guys' plays that saved the scripts since then, right? Now, comedies are going to come onto the scene later, and it's pretty much what you would think a comedy is. It's designed to make people laugh, but also to satire current events, people, institutions, and things like that. And then the Greeks liked poking fun at daily life and politics. One of the main figures here is Aristophanes. And they talk about some of these comedies being so funny that people were literally like rolling in the aisles or hyperventilating. Pregnant women were apparently, it was causing them to go into labor. They were laughing so hard. So the Greeks like to have a good laugh, the same as any of us would as well. Greek culture, in terms of art and architecture, is going to be one of the major features here. Now, during the classical period, you'll see the stressing of ideal proportions. You want to see the idea that we're going to have the human form, for example, it's going to look great. It's going to look perfect. Even if nobody that you've ever met actually looks like that, those are some good examples of that, right? Architecture, the desire for the design was to be both functional as well as beautiful to provide these. A good example is the evolution of the capitals of various columns on the porticos that they would use for their architecture, right? And as I mentioned, this art focused on the perfection of the human form. One of the other major contributions here is the evolution of philosophy. Philosophy, the love of knowledge, right? And these guys had this quest for knowledge and early reasoning processes. I don't know that people from the Enlightenment in the, say, 1700s would be quite on board with all of the methods that these guys use, but they definitely did appreciate them getting the ball rolling in this way, right? Now, many of these guys tried to theorize the nature of the universe, right and wrong, man's role, what is beauty, what is truth, that kind of thing. I don't have time to talk about all these, so if I miss your favorite Greek philosopher, I really apologize. But I do have three kind of in a row that more or less are the main ones, and also work in a sequence with each other. It's Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, right? Now, Socrates focused on examining life, the nature of the universe, but his role was to question everything. And he would go around the agora and go around all these places, what is beauty? And they would tell him, why do you say that? Right? How does that work? And so people found him to be kind of a nuisance in some respects. But that was his approach. And so we still refer to the Socratic approach of asking questions and getting people to answer you as like an educational way of doing business. And this was how Socrates dealt for the most part with his students. He didn't stand there, spouting out knowledge and having them write it down. He asked a lot of questions. One of the things that he questioned was the Peloponnesian War and why the Athenians should be engaged. And of course, the Athenians, they lose. And there's a lot of bitter recrimination for people that were apparently opposed to the war. And they're going to put Socrates to death for asking kind of too many questions with this. They vote in the jury to have him poisoned by hemlock, and he takes the poison and he dies, right? Now, Plato is Socrates' student, and thank goodness that he was, because Socrates never wrote anything down, at least nothing that we have, whereas Plato wrote a lot of stuff down that Socrates had said. So a lot of our view, for the most part, of Socrates is at least partly colored by Plato. Now, Plato is living in this period here, mostly, post-Peloponnesian War, and so he's a lot more bitter about what's going on here. And he argued against this ideal being possible. He came to hate democracy, which makes a lot of sense because it was the Athenian democracy that voted to have his teacher put to death. Because he basically said this was mob rule. As long as you can pump the crowd up, you can convince them to do something stupid. Like, hey, let's invade Sicily. Aren't we at war with Sparta? Shut up! Invade Sicily! That kind of thing. Let's kill Socrates. Well, why? He's just an old dude that asks questions. He's against the war. I'm for Athens, aren't you? That kind of thing. So mob rule is what he thought of it. He favored enlightened despotism. You can read about this in The Republic, Plato's The Republic. If you read that, I wouldn't caution you to try to get any of your modern political ideas from it. But if you're interested in what his ideas of how the ancient world's political evolution operated, it's a pretty good little window. Now, Aristotle was Plato's student. And he is, in a lot of ways, for a long time, the most useful of the three because he concentrated on trying to find themes from examining individual things, people, ideas, animals, organisms, systems, and you try to categorize all of them, right? He argues on the social front for individuals to try to band together to make a better government, and of course Aristotle is incredibly important because not only is Aristotelian logic, the idea of categorization and how what can be, what can't be, what precludes something else from being, right? Not only is that incredible philosophical, almost dogma, really, until kind of the high Middle Ages in Europe, but Aristotle is also a famous instructor himself. His student was not necessarily a great philosopher, was Alexander the Great. When we talk about Greek religion, you do have to understand a little bit of the culture. These guys are polytheistic. Most of you are sort of vaguely probably familiar with the Greek gods and goddesses. There's like Zeus and Hera and Athena, and there's Mercury. So anyway, there's a lot of these. The Greek gods, these Greek pagan gods. You had a lot of them that you're familiar with, the national ones, but they also had a lot of local ones that you might not remember, and even household gods. They also believed in nature gods, gods of the springs and the forest and the woods and stuff like that, right? Festivals and rituals were a big part of the worship. You go to some cave, which was some god's birthplace or something like that, and you do some ritual, you sway back and forth, you do some chant, you sing some song, you watch some play, whatever, right? They also believed that oracles divine the future. Right? The most famous of these was Apollo's oracle at Delphi. And you'd show up, and there'd be this lady, and she'd be on a tripod, and the vapors would come up, and she'd say some mumbo-jumbo, and you'd have these interpreters that would listen, and they would interpret from the spirit language, what you were supposed to do. They usually gave you a pretty cryptic language, though, to kind of hedge their bets. You'd show up, you'd give your gift, you'd get some oracle in response, and then you could go back to your people and tell them, hey, the oracle says we should be pretty good to go, right? Like I said, though, part of this was the fact that the Greeks were very fatalistic. They liked the idea that they would just humbly accept whatever fortune they had, slave whatever the gods had for them, even if it was kind of horrible, right? They're going to gradually develop a pretty strong sense of eternity for the soul. This is probably due to contact with the Egyptians, who had a pretty well-formed idea about this. And so you had Hades and the Elysian fields and Tartarus and stuff like that. The good guys go to one place, the bad guys go to another. From some of the early writings, you just get the sense that the Greeks could kind of believe that, well, you live and then you die, and when you die, you're kind of a shade, and you're not really doing anything. You're kind of a ghost. Anyway, this becomes a lot more well-formed at various points. When you look at Greek daily life, you have to understand that men were totally in charge, right? Women, it depended on the city-state, but a lot of women were really in repressive environments. They a lot of times weren't allowed outside the household on their own unless they had a male relative with them. So slaves, women, and foreigners were a separate lower class. You're also going to see, for example, homosexual patronage relationships are going to flourish in a lot of places, where you had like an upper class man and then a younger guy, and it became kind of a sort of passing of the torch between who's of the younger generation is going to get some patronage. There are flavors of homosexuality that are in this, although there's still some debate about how much homosexuality actually occurred. Some people are pretty convinced, oh yeah, it happened, and then some, well, maybe not so much. I'll let you guys do your own research on that. But that's generally speaking what you would have had, was there was a pretty strong split here between what men were doing and what women were doing, their views of each other, and so that's the social situation. So this gets us through the Greeks, or the classical period. Next time we pick up, we'll talk about how that begins to export itself through much of the rest of the world in the Hellenistic period.